Thank you for coming. I just want to introduce our first catechist, Justin Keena. Some of you have met his wife, Rachel. She did a nice long teaching for us yesterday. Justin is going to tell you a little bit about himself, and then we are going to be talking about the Creed this year. So thank you for coming.
I think the last time I crossed the stage was when I was in high school, graduating from Holy Family Academy back when they were on Ashland Street instead of just down on Cartier. Anyway, my name's Justin Keena. The most interesting thing about me, I would say, is that she chose to marry me. And I am going to be speaking to you today about the faith, and specifically the Creed. The way that I'm going to structure my talk, I should mention too, Rachel and I met at Franciscan University, and I've been teaching ancient Greek philosophy pretty much ever since I graduated. My degree is in philosophy and classics, but this semester my enrollment was so low that they canceled it. So this is the first time I get to speak to an audience and teach again, so it's good to see all of you, and thank you for coming. The way I'm going to structure my talk today is that I'm following the order of the Creed in which we say it. So I'm only going to cover a couple of the first lines. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I probably won't get past I believe in God the Father. Most of what I'm going to say has to focus on what faith is or what belief is. When you say I believe, what are you saying? What does it mean? What I want to do for most of the talk is explain what I think are the two basic meanings of the word faith or belief. And then I want to show you not only what they are on their own, but how they're supposed to work together in the life of every believer. And before I even make the distinction between them, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that they're separate or separable or should be separate, just that we can distinguish them in our minds. And it's good to have a grasp on the two major aspects of what it means to be a believer, so that you can lack the confusion you might otherwise be in if you see one being emphasized over the other. Okay, so like I say, most of what I talk about will have to do with I believe in God the Father, and if we have time at the end, I'll go into creator of heaven and earth, and if you have questions, we can do that too. So write them down. I'd be happy to answer questions. Okay. When you say I believe in the Creed, the Apostles' Creed specifically, there are two things that the Church has in mind, two aspects of what it means to say I believe. The first one has to do with the mind, what your thoughts are, how you think. I would call it intellectual assent, if I wanted to use a technical term. Here, the object of your belief is an idea, a fact, a truth, or something at least that you think is true. You can say, I believe that Justin is a Ste Marie parishioner, and you'd be right. But it would be a belief, and it would be something that you hold simply in front of your mind. It's an idea. And it's as simple and non-complex as that. Whenever you add in a belief about a religious idea, then you get a religious belief or religious faith. So we could say, I believe that God is three persons in one nature. You notice you have the same introduction. I believe that, I have faith that God is a Trinity. Because that idea is a religious idea, it makes the belief you have about it a religious belief. Simple. Okay. But I want to contrast this kind of belief, which I'll call intellectual belief or intellectual faith, or belief that, with what I'll call belief in, or faith in, or trust belief. So that's the big distinction that I want to hold in your mind throughout the rest of the time we have this morning. Instead of the object of trust belief being an idea or something that you think is true, now you have an object that's a person. If I said, I believe that Justin, and I stopped it there, it wouldn't make sense, because when you're talking about belief that, intellectual belief, you need an idea, not just any idea, a complete idea, something that can be true or false. Justin's a Ste Marie's parishioner, true. Justin is 300 years old, false. Okay, so you've got a complete idea. The idea is the object of your intellectual belief. But now so it doesn't make sense to say, I believe that Justin, when you have intellectual belief. But it does make sense to say, I believe in Justin. I have trust in Justin. I have confidence in Justin. Now we're not dealing just with your mind and what you think is true, or what is true, but with a confidence that you have, a gesture towards a person that you make. You have trust or faith in them. Okay. And you can tell the difference between the two, which of the two types of faith or belief that the church has in mind, usually by the preposition that comes right after I have faith or I have belief. If you see belief in, then we're talking about certainly, at least primarily, trust in. If you're talking about believe that, then you're talking about intellectual belief. Okay, but they are supposed to be united in a believer's mind. So that's why it's not a big surprise to me to find that when the church defines belief, when it talks about faith and belief, for example, in the Catechism, paragraph 177, you get both an object as truth and an object as a person in the same sentence. So this is straight from the Catechism. To believe has thus a twofold reference to the person and to the truth. To the truth by trust in the person who bears witness to it. So clearly they're supposed to be united. However, it is possible to find one or the other more emphasized than the second one. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. The one that comes to mind most obviously in the context of talking about the creed is the creed itself. When the priest does a baptism and then says, this is the faith you are about to be baptized in. When he talks about the faith, it's right after having listed systematically all the doctrines or beliefs that Catholics hold intellectually in their minds that make them Catholics. You profess that faith, you profess that creed, you say, I believe this, a checklist of what's true, what you assent to intellectually, what you agree with, and then the priest says, yes, this is the faith. So there's an example of faith being primarily emphasized as something that you think about, that you have in your mind as an idea. Now, of course, it's not isolated from the fact that you're supposed to trust in God. So it wouldn't make sense to say that I believe that God exists and that he's given me all of this divine revelation and truths about himself and ways of living out my life that will make me happy, and then not also trusting that he's the one who has the authority to tell you those things. Okay. So clearly, part of what you believe intellectually as a Catholic, part of what you profess in the creed is the existence of a loving Father who is trustworthy and deserves not only intellectual assent from what he says, but obedience from what he asks you to do. Okay, but you can see that in some cases, one or the other is emphasized in the life of the church. An example, I would say, of faith in the trust sense is when Jesus frequently tells people or calls people, oh, you of little faith. Typically, it's after they've failed to demonstrate their personal trust in him or in something God has done. And there, obviously, you would also have an intellectual component. You can't trust someone that you don't think A, exists, or B, is a person. And I'll get into that in a minute, but it's clear that I think sometimes Jesus has the trust component, the belief in component of faith in mind, as opposed to or above the intellectual one. Okay. All right, now I want to explain. So you have these two things, intellectual belief and trust belief, and now I want to show you what happens if you try to separate the two, and then, surprise, surprise, what happens when you have them combined. Okay. So it is possible, I would say, to completely separate or isolate intellectual belief from trust. You can have someone who does intellectually assent and agree to all of the teachings of the church, but has no trust in God, might even be opposed to God or reject him. In other words, someone whose mind is aligned with church teaching, with God's revelation, but whose heart and whose will is opposed. Okay. And I think the best example, for my money, comes from James 2:19. where James says, you believe that, God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Notice the believe that. Here we're talking about an intellectual assent. Clearly, the demons know all about God. That's why they chose to reject him. They know that he's making demands of them that they don't want to submit to. Having their will conform to God's is not something they want to do, but they're very aware of what they're rejecting. Presumably, they also know all the truths of the faith better than you or I ever will, because they're so good at deceiving and getting just a little bit wrong with the truth. They don't come at us saying, oh, there is no God. They come at us saying, oh, God is just the spirit of brotherhood and universal acceptance and tolerance, and there's no real, doesn't really matter what you think about him. They come at it in a different way, in a more deceptive way. Okay, so they know all about God. They have intellectual faith. They might even have intellectual knowledge. But clearly, if that's all you've got, you're in pretty bad company, I would say. Okay, so you can be as smart as you want to be, but it's not going to make you a saint. You can get as many degrees as you want to. You can be a theologian. You can have several doctorates. But just knowing the truths of the faith and being able to explain them or even defend them isn't enough. Okay, so clearly we're going to need to also have the trust kind of faith. Now, I would also say, though, that you shouldn't be able, okay, well, it's different. If you have intellectual belief, you can have that totally apart from the trust kind of belief. But I would say that it's not really possible to have a trust or faith belief in God, or really in anybody, unless you also have some kind of intellectual belief to back it up. What do I mean? I mean that, so my example is going to be Santa Claus, but I don't know if I can do that in front of a younger audience. But okay, suppose, I suppose I'll just make the point without the example. If you didn't believe that God existed at all, what would it mean to say that you had faith in him or that you trusted him? Remember, you can't trust anything less than a real existing person. It's not as if you go to your car when you make your commute to work, if you still have a commute to work, or if you drive to church on Sundays and say, you know what, car, I trust you. I believe in you. I think you can do this. Okay, so if you were doing that, you'd be speaking anthropomorphically. You'd be pretending that your car is a person, and you'd be speaking to it with a language that it doesn't really deserve. It's just an inanimate object. You can only trust something that's a person. Okay. And if you said that you believe in God, you trust God, you've given your life over to him, but you don't even think he's a person, an intellectual being capable of thinking and making decisions like we are, then the trust is more or less a fantasy. It's a mockery. It's at best you're speaking in metaphorical or analogical terms. Yes, so if you have trust in God, you're also assuming an intellectual belief that God exists. And more than that, that he's a person. If all you thought that God was the force, or universal spirit of brotherhood, or tolerance, there's no meaningful sense in which you can say, I trust in that, I trust in God. At most, what you'd be saying is, I trust other people to tolerate everyone's viewpoint, something like that. So ultimately, you have to rely on a person or group of persons when you say you have trust belief or faith belief in someone. Okay. So you can't really have a trust in God without an intellectual assent that he exists, but you can have intellectual assent that he exists without having a trust in him. Okay. But clearly you want to have both. And that's why it's not really a surprise to me when the Catechism defines faith and it gives you both of these senses. So I'll give you the reference and encourage you to read it on your own. And if I remember at the very end, I want to give you a sequence of catechism readings to do for homework, because a lot of this I'm just ripping off of the church's teaching and the doctors of the church. Okay. So this comes from Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraphs 176, 177. Faith is a personal adherence of the whole man to God who reveals himself. It involves an assent of the intellect and of the will to the self-revelation God has made through his deeds and words. To believe thus has a twofold reference, I've already quoted this section, to the person and to the truth, by trust in the person who bears witness to it. So you see both of those senses of faith or belief converging together. Let me make two other points about this passage in the Catechism. You'll notice that there's this phrase, the personal adherence of the whole man to God. So there's a big demand being made of you as a believer, as someone who has both kinds of faith in God and in his teachings. The church is setting a standard, and a very high standard, for what she's asking of you, and it's nothing less than the total submission of your intellect and will. So there are ways in which you can fail to live up to that standard. The church does not want people who are lacking in intellectual assent, who don't know what the teachings of the church are. And when I say that, I mean, of course, she wants them to have that intellectual assent, but it's better for someone to know what the faith is, to be able to agree with it. When you're at church and you're professing the creed, you make the profession of faith, we don't want to just be parrots or puppets who have memorized the words of the creed, but be able to understand them, be able to know what they mean, and to say, yes, I agree, there is one God, and he is a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Christ has become incarnated and saved me from my sins, and so on. You want someone who's not just saying the words without having the intellectual assent. It's the belief, the agreement inside your mind that counts. It's also possible to, the church also doesn't just want someone who's a cold, intellect. And this is something I can speak about from experience as being one of my dangers. I'm probably 90% intellect, 10% will and heart, which is why I have my better half to balance me out. And probably why I went into philosophy and have gone on to teach in the humanities as long as I have. But the point is, the church, it wouldn't be enough just to agree with what the church says. That's not enough. So you can, in other words, it's not enough to just be able to do a catechesis. It's not enough to be a brilliant theologian and have books published about scriptural theology and so on. But the church doesn't just want someone who's standing in the pews, reciting the creed, and understands it, but that's as far as it goes. No, she wants a total submission of mind and heart. And that's a big demand. I mean, you can compare this with your regular beliefs, your non-religious beliefs, and your non-religious trust that you have in people. If, most of you have just met me, some of you have known me for longer, and you, I presume, believe that I went to Franciscan University and I graduated from Holy Family and so on and so on. But you don't believe with the same conviction that you would be demanded by the church for believing in its teachings. Why? Well, because I'm an imperfect person, and if I'm telling you something, I'm not perfectly trustworthy as God would be. I mean, we're humans, we're fallen, there's nothing there's no commandment that I'm incapable of breaking at the moment. Okay, so what's the takeaway? The takeaway is, in your normal everyday life, you do believe things that other people say. You take things on authority, sure, but you take it with a grain of salt. If you found out that I was an imposter and there were no records of me ever having attended any universities, it wouldn't shatter your worldview. Okay. You didn't place absolute trust in me. Why? Because I'm not an absolutely trustworthy person. But when you have a divine person, not just a human person, telling you something about himself, that's all that divine revelation means. God is revealing something about himself. Instead of me revealing something about myself, making it human revelation, God tells you something about himself. That's divine revelation. And as a perfect and absolutely trustworthy being, he demands absolute and perfect trust in response. And that's the demand made of you and I as believers. Not just that, yes, we agree, we acknowledge you exist, you tell us to do all these things, but that, no, I submit, I trust that you'll take care of my life. That part of trust is the hard one. Okay. What I'd like to do with the time that I have left is to talk about what faith is not. So hopefully you've got a better sense of what faith is, the intellectual aspect and the trust aspect, and how they're supposed to work together in the life of a believer. But let me talk to you a bit about what faith is not. What faith is not. The first thing that I want to say that faith is not is, and when I say faith here, I mean more the intellectual assent than the trust component, but it's not absent from my mind. Faith is not a blind and unthinking acceptance. Faith is not indoctrination. The faith is not brainwashing. Why? You do understand some component of what God tells you. There is an appeal to your reason and to your mind. God is not asking blind faith of his followers. He respects you as persons. He made you in his image and likeness, which means he gave you, among other things, an intellect and a will just like he has. You're capable of thinking. You're capable of being more than just a parent or a trained pet. He wants you to return your love and assent to him as an expression of your free will and choice. He's not treating us like animals or like sheep, although we are compared to sheep in the sense that we follow him absolutely. We have absolute trust in him. When we hear his voice, it's instant obedience. But we're more than sheep because we're capable of thinking and of understanding. Okay, so faith is not blind and unthinking acceptance. It would be unreasonable to believe someone who didn't deserve your trust. But God, having absolute and perfect, trustworthy moral rectitude, is perfectly trustworthy. You trust people according to the amount of wisdom they have. The more experience they have, the more expertise they have in a particular area, the more you should place your trust in them. When Dr. Fauci says things about COVID, I believe him. When God says something about himself, you should believe him even more. So the degree of wisdom someone has, the degree of knowledge they have, that's their claim to your trust. And God is wisdom itself. You can't get more trustworthy than that. Okay, so you're not just checking your intellect in at the door and going along with whatever the church tells you just because you have this kind of blind faith. No, it's totally reasonable for someone who knows more than you to ask you to have faith in them about the thing they're talking about. Okay, but on the other hand, so that's the first thing faith is not. It's not a blind kind of parroting or acceptance. But faith is also not comprehension. Faith is not something, faith does not demand, when I say that you need to have an intellectual assent to the truths of the faith and the creed, I'm not saying you need to understand them in every possible nuance and detail and sophisticated application to every single possibility in human nature. No. That's why we need theologians. That's why we need new homilies every Sunday. That's why we need catechesis and formation throughout our lives. That's why we need to keep reading the Bible and applying it to our everyday existence. Faith does not mean, having faith in something means that you understand some, but not all. And I would say, I'll get back to what I mean by not all in a couple further points. And let me give you just an example, a simple example, and then I'll read to you from one of my favorite theologians, who's much more eloquent than me. But so you might ask now, well, how much do I need to understand? If I don't need to understand everything, if I don't need to be a PhD in theology, but I do need to have some kind of intellectual assent, a reasonable question to ask would be, well, how much? How much understanding do I need to have if I don't need to have complete understanding in order to have faith? And I would say that you need to understand that what the church says is true, but not necessarily how what it says is true. So, if you understand that, okay, when I talk about the Trinity, yes, I believe that there is one God, there's one supreme being. That makes sense to me. But there's also a trifold unity of persons within God. Okay, now it's okay if it doesn't make sense to you how God can be three distinct persons, but only have one substantial nature. If it doesn't make sense to you, that's okay. That just means you're a human being, and you're incapable of cramming the entire divine essence into your finite mind. That's normal. But what you need to be able to say is, yes, I don't see necessarily how it's possible, but I do see that God is saying that. And I understand that what he's telling me is he is only one God. There are no gods beside him, but there is a mystery of interiority within God such that he has three distinct persons sharing the same nature, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, so you need to understand that what the church says is true. And you need to have just a minimal understanding of each of the concepts within the teachings of the church to know what it means to say that the Pope and the teaching of the magisterium in union with him is infallible. You just need to know what those words mean, even if you don't understand how it's possible. It's okay. That's why you have theologians, and that's why you have parents and teachers and compatriots in the faith to help explain things to you. Faith is a journey. Okay. Now I'd like to read to you, to make this point even clearer, from St. John Henry Newman, whose feast day is October 9th, just a few days from now. One of my personal patrons, a convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism in 1845, and was recently canonized last year. Okay, so this is a quotation from his spiritual autobiography, or rather, the account of his conversion in chapter 5, if you're interested. And here he's talking about the difference between total understanding and having some believing that something is true that God says versus understanding how exactly it's true. So here's what he says. 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt as I understand the subject. Difficulty and doubt are incommensurate. In other words, the opposite of having faith, intellectual faith in God, is not having problems about it or having it make sense. The opposite of having faith is a doubt, saying, I don't really think that's true. I'm not so sure about that. No, that's doubt is something that you shouldn't have as a Catholic. You should give your full intellectual assent. You should submit your intellect to God because he's got the truth about himself. He's the most trustworthy person you can have to talk about himself. But it's okay to have difficulties, to puzzle, to think, to ponder. 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt. There of course may be difficulties in the evidence, but I am speaking of difficulties intrinsic to the doctrines themselves or to their relations with each other. A man may be annoyed that he cannot work out a mathematical problem of which the answer is or is not given to him, without doubting that it admits of an answer, or that a certain particular answer is the true one. Of all points of faith, the being of a God is, to my own apprehension, encompassed with most difficulty, and yet borne in upon our minds with most power. People say that the doctrine of transubstantiation is difficult to believe, and here he's just talking about what happens when Father Mo raises the Eucharist and it turns from the substance of bread and wine into the substance of the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Transubstantiation. People say that the doctrine of transubstantiation is difficult to believe. I did not believe the doctrine till I became a Catholic. I had no difficulty in believing it as soon as I believed that the Catholic Roman Church was the oracle of God, and that she had declared this doctrine to be part of the original revelation. It is difficult, impossible to imagine, I grant. But how is it difficult to believe? Yet Macaulay, who's a 19th century Victorian atheistic essayist, thought it so difficult to believe that he had need of a believer in it, of talents as eminent as Sir Thomas More, before he could bring himself to conceive that the Catholics of an enlightened age could resist, quote, the overwhelming force of the argument against it. Sir Thomas More, he says, that is Macaulay says, is one of the choice specimens of wisdom and virtue, and the doctrine of transubstantiation is a kind of proof charge. A faith which stands that test will stand any test. Now, back to Newman's words. But for myself, I cannot indeed prove it. I cannot tell how it is. But I say, why should it not be? What's to hinder it? What do I know of substance or matter? Just as much as the greatest philosophers, and that is nothing at all. So much is this the case that there is a rising school of philosophy now, in the 19th century, which considers phenomena to constitute the whole of our knowledge in physics. The Catholic doctrine leaves phenomena alone. In other words, it leaves the realm of science to the scientists. It does not say that the phenomena go, that you don't see what looks like bread and wine, that what appears to you to be bread and wine no longer appears to you. It does not say that the phenomena go. On the contrary, it says that they remain, that it still looks like bread and wine. Nor does it say that the same phenomena are in several places at once. It deals with what no one on earth knows anything about, the material substances themselves. And in like manner, of that majestic article of the Anglican as well as the Catholic Creed, the doctrine of the Trinity in unity, what do I know of the essence of the divine being? I know that my abstract idea of three is simply incompatible with my idea of one, but when I come to the concrete fact, I have no means of proving that there is not a sense in which one and three can equally be predicated of the incommunicable God. Three persons, one nature, different senses. Okay, so there's the intellectual side. The faith side would be to look at Mary and the story of Mary versus Zechariah, and I know I only have a minute or two. Read chapters 1 and 2 of Luke as part of your homework, and you'll realize that the whole point of the story is to show that Zechariah was told something to have faith in, to trust in. You're going to have a child. What are you talking about? I doubt that. I don't believe it. He's the one who was silenced in his voice. Then you have Mary presented with an equally strange future occurrence to her. You're going to have a child, but you're not going to have an earthly father for that child. Her reaction is not doubt, but it is puzzlement. How is that possible? How? But she believes that it will happen. She has faith that it will happen. And she's the one who's not silenced, but rather sings. So faith in God, trust in God, is not incompatible with having difficulties about faith. You're supposed to ask questions about the faith. The church affirms human reason and wants you to probe every possible difficulty you have and make the understanding of the faith your own. The church affirms human reason. There are a couple of other things that I wanted to mention, but I'll just close with some quotations from the Catechism about how the church affirms human reason. Okay, this is Catechism 39. In defending the ability of human reason to know God, the church is expressing her confidence in the possibility of speaking about him to all men and with all men, and therefore to dialogue with other religions, with philosophy and science, as well as with unbelievers and atheists. So the church is not afraid of difficulties and puzzles you have in your mind. The idea would be, if you are a believer, you ponder them in your heart like Mary does, and you come to a deeper understanding of them, but you don't doubt them. You don't doubt God because he demands a particular response of absolute trust from you.